You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
The ashes we leave behind. Jack Calloway was once a hero, one of the bravest firefighters in the city, running headfirst into danger to save lives. But one tragic fire changed everything. Forced into early retirement after a devastating accident, Jack is left with nothing but memories, regrets, and the nightmares that won't let him go. Every night he relives the flames, the screams, and the one life he couldn't save. To escape the ghosts of his past, Jack turns to writing, pouring his pain into supernatural horror stories. Twisted tales of haunted firehouses, shadowy figures lurking in the smoke, and an unstoppable force that follows a firefighter long after the last embers die. But as his words take shape, something stirs. The whispers in the dark grow louder, the shadows move when they shouldn't, and then the fire starts again. The horrors he writes are no longer fiction, the nightmares are real. The past refuses to stay buried. Now Jack must face the terrifying truth. Some fires never go out, and some ghosts refuse to fade. Will Jack escape the flames of his past, or will they consume him for good? Like, share, subscribe, if you dare. Jack Calloway woke to the taste of ash on his tongue and the echo of screams ringing in his ears. His heart slammed against his ribcage as he lurched upright, panting in the darkness. The nightmare was so vivid that for a moment he still felt the searing heat on his skin and saw the flicker of phantom flames dancing along the bedroom walls. The acrid smell of smoke clung to his nostrils, though he knew logically nothing was burning in his small, silent house. Beads of sweat chilled on his forehead, and he swiped a trembling hand across his face, trying to dispel the haunting images that clung to his mind. In the quiet of the early morning, Jack strained to calm himself. He sat on the edge of the bed, feet on the cool wooden floor, and focused on the feel of the solid ground beneath him. The air in the room was cool and still, carrying only the faint scent of old pine from the floorboards and a hint of his own stale sweat. No smoke, he reminded himself firmly, it's just in your head. But even as he told himself this, his ears still rang with distant phantom alarms. He rubbed his eyes until he saw sparks of color behind his eyelids, anything to chase away the visions of that fire. That fire. It always came back to that last fire. Jack pushed himself up, his joints protesting. A dull ache flared in his knee as he stood, an ache that never quite went away since the accident. He absently kneaded the scar tissue through his thin pajama pants, remembering how the debris had pinned his leg on that fateful day. Each throb was a reminder of collapsing beams, of crushing weight, of the end of everything he had been. Forced into retirement. The words tasted bitter on his tongue, as bitter as the phantom ash from his nightmare. He limped towards the kitchen on stiff legs. The house was dark, but he knew its layout by heart now. He spent enough sleepless nights wandering these rooms. In the pale glow from a streetlight filtering through the window, he navigated around the coffee table, past the living room couch. His fingertips brushed the back of the old leather couch as he walked by, the cracked material soft and familiar under his touch. As he passed the fireplace, ironic that he even had one, though he'd never lit it since moving in, his eyes caught a shape on the mantel. A helmet sat in the darkness, resting on a wooden plaque. Jack paused, breath-catching. The helmet's once bright yellow paint was scuffed and charred, a blackened stripe across its dome, a scar from that final blaze. Captain Calloway was engraved on the plaque just below it. The gold lettering glinted faintly in the low light. It was a gift from the department, given to him at his retirement ceremony, if you could call that awkward gathering a ceremony. More like a send-off none of them had wanted so soon. He remembered standing in the station house on that day, the scent of smoke and coffee permeating everything as usual. The chief had placed that helmet on the plaque and handed it to Jack with solemn eyes. He could still hear the chief's gravelly voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You did us proud, Jack, always." At the time, Jack had felt too numb to respond with more than a nod. He ran his thumb over the helmet's brim now, feeling the ridges and scratches, each one a story. It felt like it belonged to someone else, the hero firefighter from those stories in the newspapers, a man who no longer existed. A man he had buried under the weight of that collapsing roof alongside. Jack closed his eyes. A tremor passed through him, and he gripped the edge of the mantel to steady himself. In his mind's eye, flames roared anew, and he smelled burning timber. In the deepest corners of his memory, he heard a child's thin cry for help. His stomach clenched, nausea rising as the remembered stench of smoke and gasoline filled his head. He forced his eyes open and inhaled slowly, counting 1, 2, 3, just like the therapist had taught him months ago. His lungs filled with the present, dusty air, a whiff of the mint toothpaste still lingering on his breath. The real world, not the fire. The therapist's exercises only did so much. A part of him was still trapped in that inferno, crawling through choking black smoke, desperately reaching out for the little girl hidden somewhere in that burning bedroom. The whoosh of rekindled flames and her shriek as he was pulled back by strong arms, he couldn't forget it. His fists clenched on the mantelpiece, the wood dug into his palms, grounding him with a bite of pain. He exhaled slowly. The past, it was the past. But here, alone in the dim silence, the past felt more alive than the present. Jack turned away from the helmet, unable to look at it any longer. His reflection faintly showed in the dark window glass, just a tall, broad-shouldered man with sagging posture and haunted eyes. He scarcely recognized that reflection. There were new lines etched into the tan, weathered skin of his face, a permanent furrow between his brows. At his temples, strands of grey had begun to outnumber the brown. He looked older than 45. Older and lost. He moved into the kitchen and flicked on the light. The sudden brightness made him wince, but he left it on. The darkness had too many shapes that played tricks on him. With methodical movements, Jack began making coffee. It was an old habit. After nightmare-ridden nights, he knew there was no going back to sleep easily. The familiar routine of scooping grounds and pouring water gave him something to focus on. The rich scent of coffee, bitter and comforting, slowly filled the kitchen, masking any imaginary smell of smoke. He closed his eyes and breathed it in deeply. For a second, he could almost pretend he was back at the firehouse, where the drip of coffee was a constant companion during long shifts. He could almost hear the distant laughter of the crew playing cards at the big oak kitchen table, ribbing each other at 2 in the morning, waiting for the next call. But when Jack opened his eyes, the only sound was the drip of the coffee maker and the quiet hum of his refrigerator. The firehouse was miles away, and those late-night laughs were just echoes in his mind. He poured the coffee into a mug and cradled it between his hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The first sip was hot and strong, a sharp, slightly burnt taste that made him grimace. It wasn't as good as the station coffee. He never could brew it the same way Mike did. Mike always joked that he made it with extra love and a pinch of soot. Jack huffed a soft breath that was almost a sad laugh. He could almost hear Mike's voice saying it. God, he missed them. The brotherhood. The word rose unbidden, carrying a wave of longing that almost took his breath away. He missed the banter and the shared burdens, the way the guys at Ladder 19 had become a second family over the years. They had trusted each other with their lives, and he had been proud, so proud, to stand among them. Jack's throat tightened, and he took another sip of coffee to push down the emotion. Now he felt like an outsider peering in through a window at a life that used to be his. On the fridge door, held up by a magnet shaped like a fire hydrant, were several photographs. Jack found his gaze drawn to one in the center, a snapshot of him and the crew taken 3 years ago. In it, 5 men in soot-streaked turnout gear grinned at the camera, their arms slung around each other in camaraderie. Jack stood in the middle, helmet under one arm and a triumphant smile on his face. They had just put out a warehouse fire. He remembered the adrenaline, the rush of having saved the place and everyone in it. He traced a finger over the face of a younger Jack in that photo. It felt like looking at a stranger. His eyes shifted to the man beside him in the photo, a tall figure with a big mustache and laughing eyes. Tommy, his closest friend on the squad. Tommy had been there that night too, the night of the accident. Tommy had been the one who dragged Jack out of the collapsing house, saving Jack's life as Jack screamed for them to let him go back for the girl. A lump formed in Jack's throat at the memory. They never found the child until it was too late. Her name had been Isabel, he later learned, 6 years old. The memory of her mother's anguished cries on the curb still echoed in his soul. Jack realized he was gripping the photograph too hard. The edges crumpled slightly under his thumb. He released it and carefully smoothed it back against the fridge door. His hands were shaking. Setting the coffee mug down with a clink on the countertop, he flexed his fingers, trying to banish the tremors. Breathing deliberately, he recited under his breath a mantra he'd been told. "I am here. I am safe. It's over." Saying it out loud sometimes helped make it feel real. His voice sounded small in the emptiness of the kitchen. He knew the truth of it. He was safe now, physically at least. The fires were gone, the danger past, but his mind hadn't gotten the message. Every night in sleep or even in quiet moments, it dragged him back into the flames, as if some part of him refused to leave that burning house, punishing himself with what-ifs and should-haves. Jack raked a hand through his short, sweat-damp hair. It was times like this, pre-dawn and alone, that he felt the loss of his identity most keenly. He had been a firefighter since he was 20 years old, 25 years of service cut short in one terrible moment. Without it, who was he? He looked around the kitchen and living room, a modest, cozy space that suddenly felt like a stranger's house. Walls decorated with memories of a life he no longer lived. Plaques of commendation, framed news articles about daring rescues, photos of him in uniform shaking hands with city officials at some ceremony, trinkets of a career that had defined him. Now they were just items, dusty reminders. What do I do now? The question had plagued him every morning since retirement. At first, he had tried to keep busy. Physical therapy for his knee, then odd carpentry projects around the house once he could walk better. He remembered the frustration as he built the bookshelf in the living room, how even using a hammer too forcefully made his injured arm ache, reminding him of his fragility. He had almost quit halfway through, anger boiling over, until he ended up smashing a perfectly good plank of wood in two. The sharp crack and the sting in his palm had shocked him enough to stop. He still had a small scar on his left palm from a splinter that day. Jack flexed his left hand now, recalling the moment. Anger. It was easier to feel than grief. Safer. He took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm and grimaced at its acidity. After the house projects, someone suggested he try writing to fill his time. Was it his sister? Or maybe Dr. Mills, his therapist? He couldn't recall exactly, but he'd given it a shot. He remembered sitting at this very kitchen table a year ago with a brand new leather-bound journal and pen, staring at the blank page with a determination he hadn't felt in months. At first he meant to journal, get the thoughts out of his head as everyone recommended, but the thoughts were too raw, too heavy. He found himself instead scribbling out short scenes, little fictional vignettes loosely inspired by things he'd seen. It was easier to call it fiction, to put a slight supernatural twist on it, than to face the naked truth. That's how his ongoing story was born. By flashlight at midnight, or in the hazy early morning after a bad dream, he wrote about a firefighter who was haunted, literally haunted, by the ghosts of people he couldn't save, and by a monstrous fire demon that followed him like a shadow. In the story, the firefighter character, he never actually named him, but in his mind it was always some version of himself, would fall asleep and awaken in a nightmare world where the flames had minds of their own. It was strange, maybe, but it poured out of him. Page after page of chasing ghosts through smoke-filled corridors, of battling a demon made of swirling smoke and embers. Jack had never intended to share it with anyone, and so far he hadn't. The writing was sloppy, scrawled in desperation some nights when he couldn't contain the images, but it was honest in its own way, and frightening. Sometimes he scared himself with how vivid the scenes were, how real they felt. He swallowed, his throat dry, real enough that sometimes in the dark quiet of 3 a.m, he almost believed those ghosts were real. That the scritch-scratch at the edge of hearing was the demon's claws on the floorboards creeping closer, that the flicker in the corner of his eye was one of the ghosts watching him. A sudden thump jolted Jack from his thoughts. The sound was soft but distinct, coming from the living room. His heart rate spiked. He set the coffee mug down so fast some of it sloshed over, hot liquid splattering his hand. "Ah!" he hissed at the quick burn, and the mug clattered against the counter. He stood frozen, ignoring the coffee searing his skin, straining to listen. The house was silent again, but his skin prickled. Slowly, he moved toward the archway that opened from the kitchen to the living room, his socked feet soundless on the linoleum, then the carpet. The only light now was the kitchen light streaming weakly across the floor, casting long shadows. He peered into the dim living room, muscles tense. Nothing looked disturbed. The couch, the armchair, the low bookshelf in the corner, all shapes he recognized. On the far wall, the framed awards and photos glinted faintly. Everything was still. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Calmed down. Probably just the old house settling, or maybe something fell off a shelf. He flipped on the living room lamp, flooding the space with a warm yellow glow. He looked around. A book had indeed fallen off the shelf. It lay face down on the hardwood floor a few feet from the case. He approached and bent to pick it up, his knee protesting as he crouched. It was the leather-bound journal, the one he wrote his stories in. It must have been precariously tucked between other books and finally slid out. Jack exhaled slowly as he stood, journal in hand. His pulse was still a little fast, but he forced a wry smile at his own jumpiness. Jumping at shadows and falling books. Get a grip, Cal. Still, as he looked at the journal's cover, he felt a chill skitter down his spine. He ran a thumb over its cover, tracing a faint scratch he didn't remember making. The book felt warm, almost humming in his hands. That was absurd, of course, just his adrenaline playing tricks. Shaking his head, he carried it back to the sofa and sank down into the cushions. The leather creaked softly beneath him. He hesitated, then opened the journal. The pages rustled, thin and covered in dense handwriting. His handwriting, though sometimes he didn't recognize it when he read it back later, written in a frenzy, letters jagged and slanting when he'd been particularly upset. He absent-mindedly wiped the cooling coffee spill from his hand onto his pajama shirt and started flipping through the pages slowly. Snippets of his scribbled story jumped out. The hallway stretched on, lined with blackened wallpaper peeling like burnt skin. He heard the child's laughter echoing, then turned to sobs that twisted his gut. The fire demon slithered in the rafters, its eyes twin embers tracking his every move. Jack's throat tightened as he read the lines. They were good in a horrific way, visceral. He remembered writing that last one at 4 a.m. on a thunderstorm night, lightning flashes providing the only light. He'd practically seen the demon's eyes in the corner of the bedroom, the thunder rumbling like a growl from its throat. In his writing, the demon always lurked, waiting. And the ghosts of those he couldn't save, they whispered to the hero, sometimes blaming, sometimes pleading for help. He ran a hand through his hair again, then closed the journal. Enough. He didn't need to read more now. He already knew how the unfinished story went. The hero, the former firefighter, was losing the fight. Each encounter with the demon left him weaker, more uncertain, and the ghosts more relentless. Jack hadn't been able to write an ending yet. He didn't know how to make the hero win, not when he himself still felt lost in that same battle. He pressed the journal to his chest and leaned his head back against the couch, closing his eyes. The soft cushion supported his weary frame. He could feel the slight throb in his knee again, the sting on his hand from the hot coffee earlier, the lingering taste of bitter brew on his tongue. Small, real sensations anchoring him. The lamp's light behind his eyelids made a reddish glow. His mind drifted, heavy with exhaustion. Maybe he dozed, or maybe he simply sank into that half-dream state he often fell into when emotionally drained. But as Jack sat there in the stillness, he felt a familiar prickle of unease. The hairs on his arms stood up. The air in the living room, once comfortably warm from the lamp, seemed to drop a few degrees. Jack's eyes snapped open. The lamplight flickered, once, twice. The bulb's buzz dimmed. Jack sat forward, gripping the journal tightly. "Hello?" he said before he could stop himself. His voice sounded too loud, of course no one was there. But the shadows in the far corner of the room near the hallway entrance seemed to pool darker, coalescing. His heartbeat, which had just started to settle, thudded dully in his chest. In the silence he heard something faint, a crackle like dry leaves in a breeze, or like a distant fire. It was so soft he wondered if he was imagining it. He stared at the corner. It was the exact spot he'd glimpsed a figure in a dream last week. He knew it was just an empty corner with an old armchair and a coat stand behind it. Yet as he watched, the shadow by the coat stand shifted. Jack's breath caught. It looked for a moment like the silhouette of a person, small and slight. A child. His heart squeezed. It was that same shape he'd seen 100 times in his nightmares, a little girl standing just out of reach, her form backlit by flames. Isabel. He blinked hard. This isn't real. It's not real. He forced himself to stand up, his knees almost buckling as a wave of dizziness washed over him. When he opened his eyes again, the shadow was still there. The lamp flickered once more, and in that brief flash of semi-darkness, he thought he saw 2 faint pinpoints of light in the shadow, like eyes reflecting light. The hair on the back of his neck rose. The crackling sound grew louder, and now he could smell it, the unmistakable odor of burning wood and charred flesh. The same grotesque blend that had clung to his turnout coat that night. It filled his nostrils, so strong and sudden that he gagged. "No," Jack choked, stumbling back a step. His calves hit the coffee table and his mug rattled, nearly toppling. The smell intensified, and along with it came a soft, agonized sob. A child's sob. "Please, help." The voice was a fragile whisper, but it sliced through Jack. His eyes widened and tears sprang unbidden at the corners. He knew that voice, or thought he did. "Isabel," he rasped, not even aware he spoke. His head swam with confusion and terror. This had to be a hallucination, he knew that logically, but it felt so real. Too real. His senses screamed with it. The scorching heat, the crackle and pop of imagined flames, the faint orange glow that seemed to pulse in that dark corner like an ember. The sobbing continued, a hitching, desperate sound. Jack took a shaky step forward, then another. He reached a hand out toward the shadow. "I tried," he whispered into the stillness, voice trembling. "I tried to save you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His vision blurred as tears he had held back for months suddenly burned down his cheeks. For a heartbeat, the sobbing seemed to quiet, replaced by a heavy silence. Jack swayed on his feet, his outstretched hand trembling. The corner was a maelstrom of darkness and flickering light in his eyes, shapes that might have been real or just his mind's cruel projection. He caught a whiff of something else under the burning smell, a sweet scent like the shampoo that might be used on a child's hair. It gutted him. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a different sound, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the air. Jack's hand snapped back as if scalded. That sound. He recognized it too, from both memory and story. It was the thunderous collapse of a structure on fire, the roar of an inferno given a voice. In the corner, the 2 pinpoints of light flared brighter, shifting from the height of a child to higher up, a man's height, or taller. They glowed a fierce hot orange now. The shape in the shadows seemed to swell, rising higher, solidifying into a towering figure darker than black, outlined in licking flames. The smell of fire grew choking. Jack's eyes darted around, no flames in reality, nothing was actually burning. A part of him knew this, but his traumatized brain screamed otherwise. The rational part of his mind shrank as raw terror and anger surged. This was the demon from his story. He was sure of it. The fire demon that had chased him through nightmares and pages alike. He had given it descriptions in ink, a humanoid outline made of smoke and cinders, with eyes like coals and claws dripping embers that charred the ground it walked on. Now that very image loomed in his living room, pantomimed by shadows and the cruel trickery of his senses. Jack's chest was so tight he could barely breathe. The demon shape took a step forward, and the floorboards creaked, whether under his own shifting weight or truly under an unseen pressure, he couldn't tell. The light bulb in the lamp popped and went out, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the faint grey pre-dawn light starting to seep through the window curtains. "You failed." A deep, hissing voice seemed to emanate from the darkness. It might have been the whisper of wind outside, or just blood rushing in Jack's ears, but in that moment it sounded like words. Jack flinched as if struck. His back hit the wall behind him. He was dimly aware of his rapid breathing, the taste of copper in his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue in fear. The demon's eyes, if they were eyes, bored into him, unblinking. In them he saw the reflection of flames, and maybe his own terrified face. "No, he croaked, trying to find his voice, to find reason. "You're not real. This isn't real." A rumbling chuckle rolled through the room, vibrating through Jack's chest. The smoky figure leaned in, and for a split second, Jack felt a blast of heat on his face, like standing too close to a bonfire. He turned his head away, instincts kicking in. "Not real?" The words slithered around him, dripping with scorn. "I am everything you left in those flames. I am your past. I am your fear. I am you." Jack squeezed his eyes shut. "It's in my head. Breathe." He tried to slow his racing heart, but the voice was relentless, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You can't escape me, Jack," it whispered, almost gently. He felt something like a claw trace down his cheek, but when his eyes flew open, nothing was there, just empty air. Yet the shadows writhed, and the shape still hung at the edges of his vision. His skin prickled where he imagined that burning claw touching him. Anger flared, sudden and sharp, cutting through the fear. This was his mind tormenting him, his own thoughts given shape. Was he going to let it bully him like this? "Get out!" Jack growled through clenched teeth. The sobbing child's voice tittered behind the demon's rumble, a horrible duet. "You left me," the little voice whimpered. "You left us," echoed a chorus of distant voices, so many others he couldn't save over the years, all rising in accusation. Over it all the demon's laughter rumbled again. Jack's nails bit into his palms as his hands balled into fists. His whole body trembled, but now not only with fear, with rage and guilt boiling over. "I know!" he shouted, the words ripping out of him from a place raw and deep. His voice cracked in the stillness. "I know," he repeated, softer, voice hitching. "I know I failed. I know I couldn't save her, save them." Saying it out loud sent a surge of anguish through him. His vision blurred with tears again, and he dashed them away roughly. The eyes in the dark blinked slowly. The silhouette seemed to tilt its head, as if considering him. The flames in those eyes dimmed, and for a moment he swore he saw sympathy in that gaze, but that had to be his imagination trying to cope. The voices hushed, fading back into the walls, leaving a ringing silence. Jack panted, chest heaving with emotion. The smell of smoke was receding, or perhaps he was just hyperventilating enough that all he smelled was his own sweat and tears. The cold air on his damp face brought him back a fraction. What was he doing? Yelling at empty air, seeing ghosts. He felt a crack of fear that he was truly going insane. Perhaps this was what life had become, shouting at phantoms in his living room at dawn. He pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes until colors sparked. When he lowered his hands, the room was lighter. Morning was slowly arriving, pale blue light pushing back shadows through the gap in the curtains. The demon shape that had seemed so solid was gone. It was just his coat stand by the armchair after all, draped with his old jacket. The two glints that were its eyes were revealed to be reflections of a street lamp on the glass of a picture frame on the wall. Jack let out a shuddering breath. His entire body felt weak, as if he'd physically been through a fight. His shirt clung to him, damp with sweat. He reached out with one shaking hand and clicked the lamp switch. Nothing. The bulb had indeed blown. With effort, he took a step and pulled open the curtains. Pale morning sunlight flooded in, bathing the room in a gentle grey-gold wash. Dust motes danced in the beam. In this light, everything looked normal again. The smell of smoke was gone. Now he only smelled the slightly burnt coffee from the kitchen and the subtle scent of laundry detergent from a pile of clean clothes he hadn't put away on a chair. His eyes fell on the journal, lying on the couch where he'd dropped it in his fright. Its pages were splayed open, as if inviting him to return. He picked it up slowly, hands steadier now, and looked at the open page. The scrawl was his from some weeks ago. He sank to his knees as the demon towered over him, its ember eyes blazing. All around, the ghosts of his past wailed, their chorus rising like a gale. He could not fight them any longer. Jack remembered writing those lines in a moment of despair. He had left that scene unfinished, the pen trailing off in a dark scribble. He stared at the half-written page, and an image came unbidden to his mind, not of fire or demons this time, but of Tommy. Tommy with soot on his face, shaking him by the shoulders after dragging him out of that hellish house. "Jack! Snap out of it! It's coming down! We have to move!" Tommy had saved his life that night, refusing to let Jack throw it away even though the mission was lost. Tommy had always been that steady presence, the one to ground him. They hadn't spoken in a couple of weeks. Jack had been avoiding his calls. Shame gnawed at him. He hated for his friend to see him like this, jumpy and broken. But maybe that was another mistake. Pushing away the only people who still cared was only isolating him further in this haunted cage of a mind. He swallowed hard, realizing his cheeks were wet again. When was the last time he'd cried outright like this? Possibly at the hospital after the accident, when he realized the gravity of his injuries and that the girl hadn't made it. He'd cried then, with his sister holding his hand, muffling his sobs into the pillow so as not to alarm the other patients. After that, he thought he'd run out of tears, hardening himself with anger and denial. But here he was, alone and shattered. And maybe that was okay. Maybe he needed to break fully to start picking up the pieces. Jack gently closed the journal. His hands had stopped trembling. There was a strange calm in him now, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical, like the quiet after a storm. The phantoms of the night had retreated with the darkness. Now, morning light brought clarity. He felt hollow and exhausted, but not hopeless. In the calm of dawn, he realized a small ember of hope still glowed inside him, quietly enduring the long night of his soul. He knew, deep down, that those ghosts and demons were part of him. His guilt, his sorrow, his fear, manifesting in the only way his storyteller mind could make sense of them. Perhaps he was haunted, but not by literal spirits, haunted by memory, by what he lost and what he couldn't save. He ran a hand over the journal's cover again, and his eyes fell on a pen lying on the coffee table. Slowly, he sat back down on the couch with the journal and pen in his lap. The leather was warm from his body heat, and he felt a sudden affection for this object that had captured his pain. It was a mirror, reflecting his anguish back to him in metaphor and ink. But maybe, just maybe, it could also reflect hope if he chose to put it there. He opened to that last unfinished scene. The dense handwriting stared back at him. The story paused at the moment the hero was at his lowest, kneeling before his nightmares. In so many sleepless nights, Jack hadn't known how to get him back up, how to let the hero win. He realized now why. He'd been waiting to feel like a hero himself again to write that ending. But what if being a hero meant something different now? Jack clicked the pen. His grip on it was firm. He hesitated only a second, then put pen to paper. His hand moved slowly at first, then picking up speed as he formed letters. Words poured from someplace deep within, words he wasn't entirely consciously thinking about. He closed his eyes, feeling the heat on his face and the tears on his cheeks. He listened to the screams of the ghosts and knew them each. They were part of him, but they did not have to define him. Not anymore. Jack stopped, his breath shaky. Yes, that was it. He continued, finding a steady rhythm. Rising to his feet, he faced the demon. The monstrous figure paused, its ember eyes narrowing in confusion at this broken man who dared to stand. Smoke swirled around them in a cyclone, but the firefighter stood firm, planting his feet. "You have no power over me," he whispered, voice soft but unwavering. The chorus of ghosts faltered, their cries dimming to a murmur. As Jack wrote, his eyes brimmed again, but now with something warmer than sorrow, something like determination, even pride. He felt an ember of hope glowing within him, small but steady, lighting a path through his darkness as he poured his soul onto the page. He could almost see it, that nameless hero firefighter standing up against the darkness, and in his mind's eye, that man looked a lot like Jack Calloway, wearing an old turnout coat and a new resolve. He kept writing, spilling his soul onto the page. The demon roared, lunging, its claws of flame reaching for him. In that instant, the firefighter thought of all the light he had known in his life. The smile of the little girl he saved last year from a car wreck. The laughter of his best friend at a joke during a midnight watch. The pride in his father's eyes pinning his first badge on him. Those things were as much a part of him as the pain. They gave him strength now. He lifted his head and met the demon's eyes. "I am more than my nightmares," he said, and his words rang like a clear bell through the inferno. Jack had to pause to wipe his face. Tears were flowing freely, but his hand was steady. He felt a faint burn in his chest, an ache as though something long cramped was expanding again. He inhaled deeply through his nose. The only scent now was ink and paper, and the faint aroma of his cooling coffee. Earthy, real. He continued writing the climax. The ghosts began to fall silent one by one. The demon hesitated, its form flickering. The power it once held over him, drawn from every fear and regret, began to wane as he claimed those parts of himself back. He stepped forward, and where his boots fell, the ground did not burn. "Go back to the dark," he commanded gently. "You're done haunting me." Jack let out a long breath, unaware he'd been holding it. He could almost hear that demon howling in defiance, feel the ground tremble. The catharsis of the scene washed through him like a cleansing wave. He finished the confrontation with a few more strokes of the pen, writing how the demon collapsed into embers and the ghosts faded with grateful smiles or final words of farewell. The hero was left standing amidst the ruins, alive and with the dawn breaking outside the charred husk of the building. Jack wrote one final line. He walked out of the ashes into the morning light, carrying their memory with him, but leaving the pain behind. Jack set the pen down. His hand was cramping and blotches of ink dotted his fingers. The sun had fully risen now, soft light filling the room in earnest, touching everything with a gentle gold. He realized the coffee maker clock was beeping. He must have set a timer, or maybe it was reminding him to clean it. The normalcy of that tiny sound made him smile faintly. He read over what he'd written. It was raw, not polished, but it was exactly what he needed to say. In the story, he had finally given his character, the part of himself that was lost, a way out of the darkness. A triumphant, if hard-won, escape. His eyes wandered to the phone on the side table. It was lit up, a notification blinking. At this early hour, it was probably an automated alert or a calendar reminder, but it made him think of Tommy, of the crew, of life beyond these walls. He reached for the phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. There were messages he hadn't answered, invitations he'd let lapse. He opened the voicemail app, scrolling through saved messages. One from Tommy a week ago. "Hey Jack, just checking in, brother, we miss you around here. Listen, there's a little get-together at O'Malley's tomorrow night. Just us old folks from the department. Would love if you came by. But no pressure. You do what you need to, okay? Just don't be a stranger, man. We care about you. All right, call me if you want. If not, I'll bug you again next week. Heh, take care." Jack closed his eyes as the message played, letting the warmth of his friend's concern wash over him. He could picture O'Malley's pub, the smell of spilled beer and burgers, the sound of his crew's loud storytelling and belly laughs. The thought of facing them made his stomach flutter with nerves, but also it stirred a spark of longing, of anticipation. They were his family. Maybe they still would be if he let them. He hit the callback button before he could second-guess himself. The phone rang twice before a groggy, familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Tommy," Jack said, his voice soft but clear. "It's Jack." There was a rustling on the other end, as if Tommy had sat up in bed. "Jack? Hey, you okay?" Concern and surprise mingled in his friend's tone. It was rare for Jack to call first, especially so early. Jack managed to smile, and something in him eased at hearing a friend's voice that wasn't in his imagination. "Yeah, you know what? I think I will come to that get-together, if the invite's still open." A beat of stunned silence, then an exhaled laugh. "Are you kidding? Of course it's still open. Hell, I'll drive over and drag you out if I have to." "No need," Jack said quickly, a hint of the old humor returning to his tone. "I'll be there, I promise." He heard Tommy's grin in his voice. "That's great, Jack. Really great. The guys will be stoked to see you. 8 o'clock, O'Malley's. You need a ride or anything?" "No, I can manage." Jack glanced at his car keys on the hook by the door, dusty from disuse. "It's about time I got back out there." "Damn right," Tommy said, gentler now. "It's good to hear your voice, man. See you tonight, okay?" "Yeah, see you tonight." Jack ended the call and set the phone down, his hand almost steady. A nervous adrenaline coursed through him, not the terrifying kind this time, but the kind that comes before something important. He knew stepping into that pub would be hard. He'd have to face their concerned eyes, their questions, or worse, their polite avoidance of questions. But these were his brothers. He didn't have to face this alone anymore, and he was done shutting himself off from them. Jack stood, surprised to find that the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The sunbeam from the window was creeping across the floor, warming the spot where the journal lay open. He moved to the window and opened it a crack. Crisp morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of dew-covered grass and distant autumn leaves. He breathed it in, feeling the cool sting in his lungs. It was invigorating and clean. The world outside was waking up. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, a delivery truck rumbled by, sparrows chattered from the telephone line. Life was continuing, and he wanted to be part of it again. Jack gently closed the journal and took it in one hand. With the other he reached up to the mantel and lifted the firefighter helmet from its place of honor. The surface was cool and dusty. He wiped it with his sleeve, revealing the bright yellow underneath the soot marks. He weighed it in his hands thoughtfully. It felt lighter than he remembered when wearing it on duty, perhaps because he was only holding on to the memory of it now, not bearing the responsibility it symbolized. That was a different life, he murmured to himself. He carefully set the helmet back down, not as an idol of who he should be, but as a cherished relic of who he was. Next to it on the mantel was a small framed photo of himself with his late father, a former firefighter as well, both of them smiling wide on Jack's academy graduation day. Jack touched the frame gently. "I'll make you proud, Pop," he whispered, just in a new way. His father was gone 3 years now, but Jack liked to think he was watching. The thought gave him comfort and a quiet surge of courage. He had a few hours before he'd need to get ready to meet the guys. In the meantime, he decided he'd go for a run, something he hadn't done since before the injury. His knee might protest, but he felt the urge to move, to feel the ground under his feet and prove to himself he could. He also resolved to call Dr. Mills later, to set up that appointment he'd been putting off, taking control of his narrative, as she would say. Jack took one last look around the living room. The shadows were gone, banished by daylight. The house felt warm again, ordinary and safe. The ghosts that had taunted him were quiet. He knew they might never be gone completely, but he could live with them, make peace with them as part of his story. On the coffee table, the pen lay on the open journal, glinting. He walked over and read the last lines he had written one more time. His lips moved silently over the words, walking out of the ashes into the morning light. It gave him a small spark of pride. He had written that. He had lived that in a way in these last few hours without even realizing it. With a careful hand, he picked up the pen again, and at the bottom of the page he added a single line as a kind of epilogue to the chapter, both in the story and in his life. He was not the same man who went into the fire, but he was alive, and he was ready to write the rest of his story. Jack capped the pen and closed the journal on chapter 10 of his tale. A new chapter was just beginning. He didn't know what it would bring, and for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty felt less like a threat and more like a promise. With a final glance at the dawn-kissed room, Jack squared his shoulders, took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to meet whatever came next. Some fires fade, but some never truly go out. Jack Calloway thought he left the flames behind, but the past has a way of rekindling itself. Because when the ghosts of the fire call your name, you have no choice but to answer. The ashes we leave behind. You can't outrun the flames when they're inside you.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.